Hey guys, welcome back. So today we are going to be talking about the rise of really wealthy businessmen in the 19th century. We'll talk about some of their tactics that they used to gain wealth. And then we'll also look at their workers and how they tried to fight against some unfavorable working conditions. So we'll start off first with our business tycoons, are these like really wealthy businessmen. A lot of times historians will call them robber barons, which tends to be like a negative connotation. But we'll look at the negatives and the positives of some of their practices and characteristics. But in general, a robber baron is just a big businessman of the late 1800s. They would dominate certain industries in the economy. Hopefully, this will ring a bell from American One for a lot of you guys. Like John D. Rockefeller, he dominated the oil industry with his monopoly called Standard Oil. Andrew Carnegie, he dominated the steel industry with his monopoly, Carnegie Steel or Carnegie Steel. And then we have Vanderbilt. Yep, picture of him down here. He dominated the shipping and railroad industries. We have Ford, who was rising in the automobile industry with his Model T and using the assembly line that we'll talk about later. And then JP Morgan down here, who was really investing in a lot of different industries across the board, but also in the banking industry. But some of their tactics were pretty ruthless that they used to gain their wealth. They would exploit their workers. So oftentimes it was seen as these guys, gaining a lot of wealth and power and influence, but on the backs of less fortunate. But just some more details here, some of these factors that contributed to their success. One of the big things they would do is they would create monopolies, which is the complete ownership of some type of industry. Basically, there's no competition. So these robber barons could basically charge whatever they wanted for their goods. There's two ways to create a monopoly. One is vertical integration, which is basically when you control all of the aspects of creating a product. So let's say this was like the meat packing industry, you would own the cattle, the slaughterhouses, the railroad cars, the warehouses, the meat packing plants, and the distribution delivery wagons. You would own everything from start to finish when it comes to producing that product. That cuts out a lot of the middlemen and a lot of costs that you wouldn't have to pay. Another way to create a monopoly is to do horizontal integration, which is what you're probably thinking of, you're more familiar with. It's basically just buying out your competition. So it would be like, you know, um, Standard Oil that Rockefeller had, he would just buy out all of the other oil companies. Um, Andrew Carnegie was known for doing the vertical integration, where he would own everything from like the iron mines all the way up to the way that steel was distributed to the consumers. So those are two types of monopolies that they would create. They could also create trusts, which would be like a whole bunch of similar companies coming together to fix prices. Rockefeller was also known for doing that, having, quote unquote, independent oil companies, but they were all run by Rockefeller and Standard Oil, and they would just all charge the same prices. So it would be a way that there would be no competition and that prices could be fixed by the robber barons. There were also just no government regulations when it came to what businesses could and couldn't do, like creating monopolies. That's illegal today because it harms the consumer and it can harm the economy. But back then there wasn't any regulation of that. And then also there wasn't any regulation of how they could treat their workers. So they're working their laborers around the clock. There's no sick leave. There's no workers' comp. There are very few protections on what um, workers could be paid and that kind of thing. So having their workforce always working around the clock was a way that they could keep their products coming out consistently. And then also on the kind of ideological side of things, there was this idea that was popular in the late 1800s known as social Darwinism, which was basically the survival of fittest in society, saying that the rich are rich because they're more fit, and the poor are poor because they are unfit. And it was a way that basically these rich businessmen could justify the treatment of poor workers or could justify poverty by saying, well, they're just not as fit. They're destined to be a poor laborer the rest of their life. A lot of times, social Darwinism was also used to perpetuate these false beliefs that people of different races and ethnicities were less um, civilized by nature or that they were inferior in some way. So it was definitely used to justify discrimination against Irish workers as well as Black workers. A lot of these businessmen, though, on the positive side, were very philanthropic, which basically means that they donated money to help with societal ills. Andrew Carnegie wrote an essay called "The Gospel of Wealth," which basically said like if you're really rich, then you have to donate money back into society. So a lot of these rich businessmen would donate funds to help build schools or universities or libraries or settlement houses, these community centers, or hospitals or things like that. But oftentimes these robber barons are seen as kind of being two-faced. You can see it here in this cartoon with Carnegie, where on one side they're helping the poor, but on the other side they are directly contributing to why people are poor or to why society has to be fixed. So let's look at the working conditions. Speaking of these workers who are living in poverty, like I said, there's really no government regulation on what workers had to be paid or how long they should work. There's no sick leave or workers' comp for any injuries on the job. So basically, if you were sick or you just didn't come to work for whatever reason, you typically got fired. And then there was a lot of child labor during this time too, which contributed to a decrease in education, especially among the poorer classes, because these are the children that are working. Okay, so why are conditions like this? Well, kind of a lot of things I've already said so far. There's a lot of workers and there's just not enough jobs. And so workers are kind of desperate to stick with jobs that they have, even if they are oppressive and abusive. There's a lack of government regulation when it comes to what robber barons can do um, when it comes to like creating monopolies, but also when it comes to working their workers around the clock. There just weren't, any like worker protection laws. There's social Darwinism, this idea that the poor are poor because they're unfit, so it doesn't matter if their working conditions are bad. And then also with the use of electricity, workers could literally work around the clock because, and when it came dark at night, they could continue to work into all hours of the night and the morning. The workers wanted to fight back, so they created some unions. There are lots of different unions. We're just going to mention two here. Um, One was the Knights of Labor. They were an inclusive labor union. They were open to all workers from all industries and all skill levels. And their big kind of platform was to have a workday broken up into three 8-hour sections. So 8-hour workday, 8 hours for rest and sleeping, and 8 hours for leisure. Another famous labor union of the time was the American Federation of Labor. It was only opened to skill workers of, certain skilled crafts. So that maybe that was like shoemaking or um, carpentry. It's basically like you couldn't just be like an average person working in a factory. You had to have some type of specific skill. Now, the American Federation of Labor still exists today. It's called the AFL-CIO, and it is a international labor union currently. And so these labor unions tried to negotiate with their um, factory owners. However, a lot of times these negotiations went nowhere, and so they decided to strike. However, during this time, strikes just weren't really successful for a few reasons. One is because workers could just be fired. So some people were scared to strike. Another reason is that they would sometimes kind of devolve into violence. So you had workers who were striking seen as being like anarchists and being, against the economy and against the United States. And sometimes like police officers would be killed in some of these violent incidences. And so it just kind of turned public opinion away from these labor unions. Some examples, some famous strikes were the Haymarket Riot of 1886. You can see some images here. It definitely devolved into violence, and a few police officers were killed. When it was reported on the next day in the newspapers, the strikers were blamed, and it just turned public opinion against them. There was the Great Strike of 1877. This was a strike that actually ended up stopping rail traffic across the country, which disrupted travel and the shipping of goods and things like that. And so the army was sent to end that strike and restore productivity to keep the economy going. Some other strikes, the Homestead strike, this was a Carnegie Steel company strike, it was ended. And then the Pullman strike, this was a situation where it was a railroad company that was actually having all their workers live like kind of on a compound with the factory. However, they were still charging these workers rent, but they weren't paying them enough money to afford the rent that they were being charged. So they went on strike. But either way, both of these ended in violence. So we'll talk later on this semester about when labor unions start to become successful and these strikes start to kind of work. But it's important to recognize that in the 19th century, these strikes are not really working, and public opinion is just kind of against these workers. So you're going to have these bad working conditions continue for a good period of time into the